must constantly look at things in a different way.
The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast was created by two physical therapists out of the desire to learn more about the different educational roles in physical therapy and healthcare, and how healthcare education works by talking with educational leaders and people with different perspectives within physical therapy and across interdisciplinary lines on how education can be improved to disrupt the status quo of healthcare education. This is our journey, and thanks for listening. Are you a third-year physical therapy student that excels on tests when you have study guides, checklists, and deadlines? With all of the information available about how to prepare for the NPTE, it's easy to get disorganized and not feel prepared going into the big day. NPTE Prep Success is an online course that provides PT students easy-to-use study guides and step-by-step guidance through the NPTE preparation. To learn more, visit kylericeprep.com. Thank you again all for your continued support, and now for the show. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. I am, of course, your host, Brandon Powen, and today I am joined by two incredibly special guests to talk a little bit more about continuing education, particularly kind of gathering perspective of managing and operating a continuing education company, but also kind of touching base on some of the main topics and issues regarding physical therapy, continuing education. As with that, I'm very happy to welcome Doctors Gregg and Vicky Johnson. If you're not aware of who they are actually the founders of the Institute of Physical Art, which is a very well-known continuing education company. Well, Gregg and Vicky, thank you so much for all the contributions that you've made to our profession throughout the years, as I know you've done a lot, and I really appreciate and value your service. But of course, I recognize that some listeners might be on here and they maybe haven't heard of you or known a little bit more about what you guys have done. So before we dive into the topic of, the Institute and talking about some of those topics, would you each mind just sharing a little bit of background and kind of like a brief overview of, who you are and how you've ended up to where you are today?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us. Our passion is always to share with others and hopefully inspire them. So I love always being asked who I am and how did I get here today, because it's interesting where that perspective comes from. So my first answer is that I'm a woman who's a wife and a mother and a physical therapist and an educator and a businesswoman. So that's who I am today, and kind of how I got there was a very special journey. And I have always been very interested in business. Originally, I wasn't even going to be a physical therapist. I wanted to be a lawyer, then a business major. But as I was in nursing school to kind of just have a degree that could get me through those other professions, I fell in love with medicine. And I didn't even know physical therapy existed. And so I feel like just events fell into place that brought me to this profession that were beyond my scope of understanding. But the thing that brought me to where I am today, I think, is built a lot on who I am as a person. And that is that I was always someone who loved art. I was a dancer. I played piano. I loved music. I was always an athlete. I loved movement. And so my attraction to coupling together an understanding of art and the movement system of the human body, I think, drove a lot of my passion and desire to grow as a human being. But I was never one who was satisfied with status quo. That's kind of why I left nursing. We marched on the Capitol in Georgia in 1977 to try to change the way nurses were respected in the state of Georgia. And I realized that I needed more. I wanted to push myself more. I've always been kind of an activist. I've always wanted to make sure that as a physical therapist, I was doing the very best I could for both my patients and my profession. And so what brought me here today to who I am today is my desire to not only be the best physical therapist I could be, which means balancing my role as a wife and a mother and a businesswoman, but the best mentor and the best inspiration I could be to others to share my 42 years of experience.
Well, I love it. It's such a powerful story. And Gregg, I'd love to kind of hear your story and kind of hear some of the parallels I'm sure that exist between that and her story.
Well, I think that often happens within anyone's life. You look back at your journey and recognize that there were critical moments that made that change. So I'd have to say each one of those kind of monuments in my life where critical things happened to me, opportunities occurred, decisions were made. Each one of those tended to help to influence to where I am today. That whole journey really began as I was looking at becoming a dentist. I was accepted on the waiting list to University of Kentucky and decided maybe I ought to go find out exactly what dentists did or what they do. And I got to go and spend time with my dentist. And in that day, I recognized this is not what I want to do for the rest of my life. I don't want to be inside people's mouths. That left me basically 3 days in which I had no idea what I was going to do for the rest of my life. And that was, I went to visit my grandfather, and he had a physical therapist who came in on that Saturday, couldn't come on the Friday because he had a flat tire. And I got to watch this physical therapist treat my grandfather, who was a paraplegic. And I said, that's what I want to do. I saw him light up. I saw him become much more satisfied to be alive by this physical therapist interaction with him. And so that was the beginning of my journey. The next interface was really the opportunity that I had. I went to University of Southern California for PT school. And at the end of the time, Maggie Knott, who helped to develop PNF and was at Kaiser Vallejo at that point, offered 3 residencies for one of us that were graduating. We had 40 in our class, and all 40 of us wanted to take on this residency. We put our names in a hat, and what ended up was I was one of those 3 names pulled to get to be in that residency. Had that not happened, who knows where my life would be. By the time I got through my clinicals, I was absolutely convinced that I did not want to be a physical therapist. There was nothing about what I saw in the clinicals that was about the service to patients. It was about the giving, about the ability to have skills that would make a difference in another person's life, which was my driving force. But I had this responsibility of a 1-year residency to go through. And when I got to Kaiser Vallejo, everything changed because I got to see people and a system that could make a difference in every patient that was being treated. I got to see changes from the very first day I was there. I got to watch Maggie problem solve and interact with her patients in a way that made a difference for me. And so for me, those were the critical times that really made the differences to get me to where I was committed to what I consider the greatest profession on the planet, which is physical therapy.
Well, I really appreciate both of your stories because I think there's so much value in that and how they shape where you guys have gotten. And of course, you kind of had both mentioned some hints about this, but of course, I want to dive in a little bit more specifically, kind of more with the company start off. And I understand how each CEU company, and frankly, every company for that matter, has usually started from, unique circumstances, and they've had some different reasons for doing it. So let's wind back the clock. Let's go back in time here to before the Institute was actually developed. What events or things that happened to both of you kind of contributed to you both actually deciding to formally create the Institute?
I think that what started happening was Maggie gave me opportunities to start doing continuing education with PNF. I got to go to Sacramento, into San Francisco, and start teaching some evening courses. Got to, when she was ill, go to Illinois and do the state chapter teaching. And all of a sudden started realizing how important it was to reach outside of Kaiser Vallejo for continuing education. But the critical moment really happened when Vicky showed up at Kaiser Vallejo on the month before I left Kaiser Vallejo. And I started having time with her and realizing here was a woman who had vision, who could take the things that I was passionate about and help to create structure around it. So Vicky really has, as she said earlier, that business skill, that vision skill, that ability to help create. And so we co-created a lot of these things. And so the Institute of Physical Art came out of both of our passions to both present what we were excited about, but also maybe to make a difference in our profession. For both of us, we've always had that altruistic idea that we needed to be able to take what we had and give it to others. And so the Institute of Physical Art was never formed as a business to make money, but as a vehicle to serve.
So I think that when I try to think about why we formed the IPA, I really try to focus on that why. There's a lot of logistics, which I know we'll get into later about how we formed it, but I think you're right. I believe that the most successful companies in the world come about because there's a why that's being satisfied by the formation of a company. There's a desire that's being met by that. And so then if you really want to delve back to what initiated or started that why or that desire, that's kind of what Gregg was sharing. And for me, it was the excitement I felt when someone gave me knowledge that changed my perspective about who I could be and what I could be. The excitement, you always think back to your best teachers, and there were always in high school or college, these pivotal faculty or teachers that you see back and go, wow, there was one day in class that just kind of changed who I was. And what I noticed is my first change happened when I was on an affiliation with Pat Payne, who back then had worked with Maggie for many years, and she was in North Carolina, and I went and did an affiliation, and she did a end of day in service. And I remember this quadriplegic patient coming in, and she put him on the table and said, now roll. And of course he couldn't roll. And he was an incomplete. And within 5 minutes of treating him, she had him initiating and partially rolling independently. And all of a sudden, this excitement I felt was just, I couldn't contain it. I was like, oh my gosh, I want to do that. And then I went out to Kaiser to learn so I could improve who I was. And I was influenced by all these faculty who I realized they were doing their job, but their job was really to make me more excited about what I had the potential to do. And I met Gregg, and I experienced something that to me was a very root of who we are as a company. And that was that he would take his weekends, as busy as he was working, because he'd always work late at work to teach others and everything, but he'd take these weekends and he was experimenting and developing with the myofascial system and what we now know as soft tissue mobilization, which was not part of PT in the 1970s. And he was experimenting, and he would bring these people together. And I would kind of sit on the sofa and watch this man transform these other therapists' attitudes about what they had the potential to do. And he was doing it, and he was very kind of content and happy to just be doing these little weekend things with these therapists in the Bay Area. But I was sitting on the outside, and I was going, oh my gosh, Gregg, you don't see what you're doing, but you're transforming these people. They leave here and they go back, and when they come back and see us a couple of weekends, all they can talk about is how much more excited they are to be a PT. And I think that is something, I love doing that. I said, this is something we should share our passion, because we want to see other therapists discover their potential. So we should try to figure out how we can do that and try to see if maybe we can go out and inspire others to be as excited about this incredible profession that we are in. And that really is the why of how the IPA came about.
That's one of the components that Vicky's sharing there that makes the difference. I'm 71 years old. And at 71 years old, I still have the same fire inside of me to help my patients and to teach others to do the same. This last week, we had our certification here in Steamboat Springs, in which we had 31 individuals coming in to be tested through that certification process. This was our 23rd time that we've done that. And each time has been so uplifting and so rewarding for us to be a part of. This one was extra special in our wrap-up to have so many individuals say that they were ready to leave the profession, but then they found us. They found this organization that we are so honored to be a part of and to be able to work within. And to sit back and recognize for all those hours that we have worked hard, all those extra evenings to keep the organization going, all those times of study to become better at what we're doing, is worth it when we just hear a few people say that their lives are different because of what we've done.
I'm sure not even just from a provider standpoint, but think of how many patients that's ultimately influenced over the years. I mean, exponentially. And I mean, I think it's fantastic that, I really love how that mission is really
not to just train people a certain way, but really to encourage the best in themselves and really continue to light and maintain that fire that keeps them passionate and pushing to develop and ultimately serve patients in our profession better. And I really love that message. And Vicky, you kind of had mentioned a little bit about some of the logistics, and you're right, we are going to dive into that a little bit because I understand that I realize that things might be different today, but just to get a kind of understanding of what you both went through at the time when you started up the Institute, what hurdles or things did you guys have to overcome to actually get the Institute off the ground and be able to provide CEUs at that time?
Well, I think it's really interesting. And given that probably a lot of your audience is going to be younger professionals, hearing some of the things that we had to do is kind of like trying to explain how you had to get up off your sofa and go change the channels on the TV. And so, when we first started, it was quite funny, actually, when you reflect back on it. But we were, when you're so young and passionate, you don't see anything as a hurdle. You just go for it. And so I remember sitting down with a typewriter and pieces of paper, and they actually being able to go get something photocopied back in the 70s was kind of an ordeal. But we sat down with a typewriter and we went to the stationery store and we took our little brochure that we had typed up and we bought some really pretty stationery, and we went into magazines and publications and found addresses of schools, and we began to hand write and address these brochures that said, we want to come share with you about PNF because we want your students to know how exciting it is, because PNF is really, as we'll talk about probably a little more, it was the foundation of what our company offers. And so it was like, so we sat there. So the hurdles were communication to our potential audience, to our potential customer. We didn't have internet. You didn't even really have a way to, if you had your local phone book, but you didn't have a way to look up addresses and phone numbers of other people. So you didn't have phone books. You had to rely on the American Physical Therapy Association to have publications that you could go in and find people to send stuff to. Our first brochure that we sent out, it was actually printed. We had a party at our house where we had 8 people over, and we hand folded this brochure. We hand applied stickers with addresses on it. We put stamps on. The organizational things that are now so automated and so easy to process. You call up, you have multiple companies you order mailing labels from. You have, multitude of printing companies, either local or distance, that can work with you and help you accomplish these tasks of creating. You have digital ways of marketing. We use internet, we use Facebook, we use Instagram. All these things that were not even conceived at the time when we were starting. So the way that we succeeded was word of mouth. It was word of mouth. It was someone would take our course and they would go and work in another clinic and they would tell all these people about what they had learned, that those people would call us and say, could you come to our clinic and teach this course? So in the beginning, our growth occurred 100% by word of mouth. And that was fine with us because, again, we didn't have this vision. We want to be a Fortune 500 company or anything like that. We want to offer this many courses a year. We just wanted to be able to meet the need as it was expressed to us. So I think in the beginning, the biggest hurdle was technology and communication and organization. But as our reputation grew, and as the course offerings grew, because we started with PNF and then Gregg offered the very first soft tissue mobilization course ever taught in our profession, which was then Functional Orthopedics 1. He basically introduced that into our profession. As the different types of courses grew, the biggest hurdle was the development of faculty. How do you, in an environment, again, back in the 70s and early 80s, how do you bring around you people that you can mentor enough to make sure the message is the same? So because you want your faculty, Gregg and I were very adamant, the faculty had to be little Greggs and little Vickies. They had to be having the same passion. They had to have the same message. They had to have the same clinical experience. And so the second major hurdle was making sure we weren't just sending people out to teach something that could be replicated, but more importantly, that could be taught with the same passion and desire that we started our very first course with. So you had technology, communication, faculty, and then, of course, it was the whole administrative aspect of starting a continuing education. What records were important to retain? The development of manuals. Again, we didn't in the early days have a computer. You didn't even have, our first software program was AmniPro, but back we were still typing up our manuals, typing how do we replicate even what we're going to hand out. Back then we didn't even have the ability for photography and doing pictures. It was all just, here's what we're going to study, let's do it in the class. So I think that, again, going back to my earlier conversation, if you're in the, 2019, 2020, you're thinking, I'm passionate about something and I want to start teaching this. I want to share this passion. And you want to hear from people who've been doing it for 42 years. What were some of your hurdles? There's a recognition that it isn't the hurdles, I think, that are so important. It's the attitude in which we approach the hurdles. And it's the ability to say, because every generation is going to have its own hurdles. And the common thread is, if you're passionate enough about something and the why is important enough to you, you find a way. And you let the hurdles actually challenge you in a positive way. You just stress is a positive thing if it's assimilated and used to help guide you to grow. And so that was always for Gregg and I. I mean, there are so many other hurdles I'm sure I could eventually talk about, but it was more the process. We come up against something and we say, okay, we can figure this out. How are we going to make this work?
One of the powers of our relationship that really lends itself to an organization is that we have that ability to take our individual strengths and apply those to helping to grow the business, and the recognition of the other's strength and allowing them the ability to be able to do that. And so for us, it's been that mutual support that we provide each other, that mutual respect that we have for each other, that has allowed us to not only be husband and wife, but business partners and co-faculty members. Our interface is extensive, and it's really required that kind of personal relationship that has allowed it. And so in those early years, it was learning how to take our strengths and being able to manifest them. Because the vehicle, the Institute of Physical Art, for us to be able to start doing our teaching and to meet the demands that were really there, because there weren't many continuing education companies in 1970. We were one of, what would you say, two pages?
Not even two, five, maybe five
in the journal.
Companies, yeah.
So continuing education wasn't a large thing. And most of the ways that continuing education was run back then was 7 to 9 day courses, 1 month long courses. There weren't a lot of 3.5 day courses out there, which is what we really formulated, teaching Thursday night through Sunday, and being able to offer that to individuals so they didn't have to take a full week off work. And so it became a vehicle that really allowed a lot of individuals to be able to attend our courses and being able to learn the material and take it back to the clinic and come back to the next one excited to learn the next level of information.
Well, I think that's really interesting. And of course, like you had kind of said, when the Institute seemed to have been starting, there was definitely much less individuals that were kind of doing continuing education at that time, less options, shall we say. And of course, you had mentioned earlier, Vicky, about the importance and the big utilization and early attribution to part of the success being word of mouth, from that avenue. But of course, I recognize that in today's day and age, like having that is definitely a bit different. And how definitely there's such many more companies, and then therefore, acceptance among companies, among the general profession can be a little bit more tricky. So given, of course, even I recognize there was less at the time when you guys were starting, but would you guys mind diving a little bit more into kind of how the Institute was viewed or how it even was accepted when it kind of first started out? Because I know, like you said, there were a lot of firsts from this company and from this thing that kind of shaped a lot of things moving forward.
Well, I think there's different kinds of acceptance that we experienced in those, and lack of acceptance that we experienced in those early days. First of all, the acceptance among the general practitioners when they finally got into a course where they got to see that during the course, their bodies made substantial improvement, their symptoms reduced, that they got to be able to learn techniques that they could apply that next day in the clinic. Among the practitioners, there's a huge amount of acceptance. But among the, I can't say leaders of the profession, but there was a group that would really say is the core of our profession. We were truly viewed as outliers. We were out there teaching PNF for orthopedic care. We were teaching soft tissue mobilization. We were saying manual therapy is the most important vehicle that we have as physical therapists, and the ability to train patients how to become aware of their bodies and become more efficient in the use of their bodies. And there was quite a bit of pushback. When I went into my first presentation at Combined Sections in 1982, I presented on soft tissue mobilization, a slide presentation with typewritten pages on these slides. There was a good portion of the group very excited, but there was another portion of the group that basically communicated they didn't believe what I was doing was part of our profession and that I was an outlier. And so it was that balance. I would have to say that, of course, those kind of feedbacks make it difficult, but the passion that we shared never seemed to be diminished, and we continued forwards to where today many of the things that we were presenting and introducing to our profession now have become foundational within that.
And do you feel, Greg, that given, of course, when, of course, you're going to have groups of people that perhaps may not share a certain viewpoint or support of a certain method or line of thought, do you feel that some of their critique has actually made you guys more effective and you've grown from that and adapted?
There's no question. I think that anyone who is mature enough to take feedback and hear it should be mature enough to analyze that feedback and determine, is there something in the direction we're going that we can change to enhance it? You know, and Vicky and I have always been on that journey of accepting it. That I think one of the strengths that we have as educators is that we're integrators. We don't just jump on a bandwagon and defend that bandwagon. What we do is we always see that anything that is being developed, whether it's evidence that's been developed through a scientific process or ideas that others have, every one of those components, if they have value to the patients we treat, we see that we have created a scaffolding that anything from the outside can be integrated within that.
I think that it's important also to recognize within our relationship that there's a age difference. And so Gregg already had 7 years of experience by the time I came into the profession. So I came in very much, I just was I was like a vacuum. I just wanted to take everything in. And I spent my first 2 years just taking every continuing education I could just to be able to be better at who I was. So I was more in the beginning, even though I was starting to teach, I was on the outside watching Gregg take this role within our profession of being a leader. And eventually this man was not only my mentor, but he became my life mate, my husband and the father of my children. So I analyzed it and observed it from multiple different angles. And it was very disheartening to me to see attitudes that existed between certain people toward Gregg because they didn't have the ability to do what he did. So it was easier to say what he was doing was not good. And instead of saying, wow, okay, I can't really understand what he's doing, but I hear all this feedback and these positive things, it was much easier to say, oh, we don't promote gurus in our profession, or we don't want, people are just following him because he can make these things happen in the clinic, but it's not something he can really teach. It's just him that can do it. And I saw that was very much not the truth. His whole desire and passion was nothing more than to see others be better than himself. He never wanted to put himself up as being good. He always wanted to say, if I can do this, you can do this. We have a saying that I do in every class I teach. As I'm introducing the class, I tell them, I say, okay, now we have a very important rule in this class. I said, everyone leaves your ego at the door. I said, because you don't learn unless you're open to hearing feedback. And I share a story of where I was in a class and, a few years ago it was a class on the ribs, and I was with an extremely competent partner who's been a therapist as long as I have. And I just, of course, went to lab thinking, I got this, I know how to work with ribs. And I put my hand on her and she's like, no, Vicky, that's not quite right. And after about 5 minutes, I had a choice. I could be getting really frustrated, or I could be going, no, wait a minute. This is an opportunity for me to grow and learn. And so because that's always been mine and Gregg's attitude, it's hard to understand sometimes when other people look at you and try to judge why you're doing something without really understanding. And we never, ever, ever did this for personal gain or for personal recognition. It was just to try to take someone, like you said, of yourself, someone who may not have come into the profession recognizing how powerful every day could be for you, how you could come home every day and go, oh my gosh, even if you'd have patients that made you cry, or patients that challenged you to the nth degree, you came out of that clinic that day going, I'm making a difference in people's lives. And that was what we wanted. And I think that you could say, were we accepted? Yes, we got invited to speak at multiple state and still do state, local, national, international conferences. I've spoken at the World Conference. Both of us have spoken at IFOMPT. We've been invited to speak at many conferences. It's that general feeling of, please don't judge me and what we're doing unless you step into my arena and walk with me. Come to my party, come to my gathering, come to my dinner, sit around with me and understand, and then guide me. And I can tell you that those that have chosen to do that, those that have really seen our hearts, but have felt like we could grow and help us be more accepted, they are the ones that have impacted Gregg and I the most and helped us to become even better at who we are.
Brandon, I want to add a little bit more here that might help the audience better understand the paradigm that we started out with and how that paradigm sometimes came in conflict with the way that physical therapy was being viewed. Partially because of our learning from Maggie Knott. Part of it was my looking at the alternative healthcare systems of Rolfing and Feldenkrais and other components like that. The way we were teaching was looking at two major components. One is, what is the most efficient state that the system you're treating could become? Instead of looking at it, how do you get it out of symptoms? The symptoms are only part of what's limiting it from being efficient. And so we always have taught the therapist to have a passion to look for creating an efficient state and a better life experience for each one of their patients. And the second component was really that instead of treating symptoms, we would treat function. And by looking at the enhancement of function, we were shifting the paradigm. When you shift a paradigm in a profession that is designed to treat symptoms and local regions, therapists back then would know how to just treat the knee or just the back or localize themselves into it. And we were saying, to really understand how to treat a headache patient, you need to understand how they walk or how they function or how they sit. And that we need to understand the system as a whole. And so we've always been a systems approach trained teachers instead of one that are localized.
Well, I think that's a really, really good point, both of you, on numerous avenues of that. And I'm going to kind of ask you, because I'm sure that over the years you've probably reflected, of course, on your journey, on your startup. And so hypothetically, if you could each go back and do things differently earlier on in the Institute's formation, if you would have changed or done anything differently, what would you have done differently?
I honestly have to say that I can't think of anything I would have done differently, because I feel that every mistake I made or every moment where I had to shift gears or change something, that was a very important learning moment for both myself personally and for us as a company. And I think that sometimes we've never really had any major issues that were catastrophic enough within our company that we could say, wow, other than, I hired the wrong person and had someone working for me that stole money from me. Maybe I shouldn't have hired that person. There are always those kind of things. But in terms of the overarching goals of your company, the pace of the growth of our company, some people looked at me and said, wow, you could have been so much bigger, so much sooner. And I was like, yes, and I wouldn't have been a mother. And I made a decision very early on in my life. And this is what I mentor to a lot of the women that I teach, because they look up to me and they say, wow, you're a successful businesswoman. How did you do it? I say, I put my family first. I put my family first and my company second. So our business stayed small. And that was okay with Greg and I. We would impact the people we could without sacrificing who we were. That's why when you asked me that question at the beginning, I said, the first thing is I'm a woman and then I'm a wife and a mother. That's who defines me. So many physical therapy women are struggling with that today. So many women in physical therapy, as well as men, find it hard they find their identity and their value as a PT rather than who they are first, and that the PT benefit from that. And so I have to say that I think because I was blessed to have a partner and a husband, that we could balance each other and call each other back into the right perspective if we found ourselves kind of drifting a little bit from who we were. I have to say, I don't think there were a lot of things I would have done differently. Every step of the way I feel has been important to get me to where I am and where my company is today. Greg?
Brandon, on this, I think there's an overall issue related to how we view whether something's a mistake or it's a part of our journey. You also used the word learning experience, and I think that that's a much better one. It's as Edison said, I didn't ever really fail. I just found out what didn't work to make a light bulb until I finally developed that light bulb. What we're finding today, Brendan, is we have a different group of students that are in our classes. Many of them have never really been developed by the anvil of failure. They haven't had many opportunities in their life to not succeed. And for us, we recognize that a lot of who we are today is how we learned from our failures. The failures were very important. The challenges we had and how we met those challenges were an essential part of who we became today. And a lot of our mentorship of our students really is to assist them in being able to be able to learn from their failures rather than become victims of their failures. And it's a real challenge. Many of those who are trying to get certified, if they don't pass, the devastation that they've got because they haven't yet learned how to be able to fail and how to move on from that. And it's really one of the challenges of our present generation.
Well, I think that's a really, really good point. And I'm sure, and I know if we discuss that further, I know it's very multifactorial. And I mean, not just from a societal view, but also from an educational view. So I know there's a lot of things that certainly can contribute to that. And of course, you guys had kind of mentioned, some of those early moments and such. And I'm just kind of curious, like, are there any, from doing the management and kind of doing everything with the CEU company, what have you guys found to be the most difficult aspects of actually managing a company? And maybe even some things that you don't think people on the outside are really aware of?
I think it's a perfect transition because we were kind of talking about, what would we have done differently? What were some of the learning moments? And then what are more difficult aspects of running the company? I think the most, if you could, and I don't want to use the word difficult. I'd rather use the word challenging. I think one of the most challenging aspects of running any company is to allow for change when it's needed. Yep. And I think that that's probably where most companies fail, is that both in their vision of what it is they want, their passion vision, as well as their business model, they become too rigid in what they're doing and don't allow for change. Yeah. Right. I think that one of the biggest challenges was learning to have that balance between who we are as people, which are very trusting and just believing in the goodness of everyone around you, and realizing that when you're running a business, there are business models and business guidelines for a reason. You get things trademarked for a reason. We never did that in the beginning. We were like, oh, people, they know we teach this. We've been teaching it for 25 years. They would never use our terms. Well, we learned the hard way. People don't always respect. And I think that's a key thing. We would respect, it isn't always reciprocated. So we've learned that there are now, the minute something is created within our organization that is unique or done, we realize part of the business strategy is to make sure that we just document things more appropriately. So I think another really big challenge was learn that fluidity. I see companies that today that have been around for, let's say, 25 or 30 years are still teaching the same thing. And you can't do that. That's saying that nothing has changed within our profession. Our profession has changed so dramatically in the last 25 to 30 years in a very positive way in some ways and then not so positive way in others. But the positive is that we have so much more knowledge now, so much more knowledge available to us because of research, so much more knowledge available to us because of technology. And so it's kind of like for Gregg and I, it was a huge challenge. You've been teaching, you have faculty trained, you have a time schedule, and all of a sudden, we now learn we have representation of our proprioception that can change on the sensory homunculus. And then Hodges comes around and tells us we have representation on the motor homunculus that changes. And it's like all of a sudden the way we're teaching something is no longer the right way. And the challenge is being willing to go through all the struggle and the hassle and the time-consuming effort it takes to just redo it. Because the right way is always the right way. The right way represents where we are today. Because when I have a student come into my class that's just graduated and they have all this current science, if I'm not speaking to them on that level and helping them understand how all the things they've been learning about motor learning and pain science and all those things, how they integrate into being a manual therapist, I'm doing them a disservice. I'm confusing them. So for me, one of the most challenging things is being flexible. And so if you're flexible in your course development, in your course content, that means you have to have a management team. So we call them the brain center. We have a huge management team. We couldn't succeed without them. There are 7 individuals, really 8 individuals that work on managing all the behind the scenes stuff for the company. Those people have to be flexible. We go in and say, you know what, we're changing this. So now we need these videos, we need these pictures. They've got to believe enough in the message that we're trying to get across, the goal and why of who we are, to be willing to put in the effort and energy. So I think the most difficult components of managing, not as successful in terms of a worldly view, but as successful in terms of a goal vision view, continuing education company, is being able to bring together the entire team that's willing to continuously adapt what you're teaching and make sure you're always on the cutting edge, and not just the cutting edge of what we know, but the cutting edge of how to challenge us to want to know more.
You know, I think that Vicky has covered it very well, but there are a couple aspects that I'd like to add is that no matter what your product is, that product doesn't have much of a chance of getting to the general public without a vehicle to carry that public to. Therefore, what we learned very early on was that organization, the structure of that organization, the goals that you set within that organization are as important as the product that you're providing. Vicky and I have always tried to emphasize those who we hire to help that vehicle be able to be there have to be as enthusiastic and excited about the product as we are. And so a lot of our time with those who we hire is to educate them about the vision of our institute, to educate them about what it does to both those who learn from us and the general public that receive from them. So if you go to any one of our employees, hopefully within a year, they share that vision and they believe that they're a major part of that. And so the organization becomes that important aspect that we have to work towards. And it's difficult because we just want to be out teaching and treating. We don't want to be organizing and hiring and firing and developing protocols and manuals and everything else to help that business function. But it's the only way that that vehicle can ever be able to be presented to the general public.
Apart from, I know you both had mentioned a lot of things earlier about kind of what makes the Institute unique. And there's been a lot of themes throughout the discussion already, with a few of them being, looking at the body system as a whole, looking to more so restore function rather than just addressing symptoms. Your team working behind the scenes, the flexibility of that team, and there's many others that I didn't touch on there. But what are some other really important aspects and that kind of really make the Institute unique, that make it stand out?
That's a good question, Brandon. I tend to always approach these things as to not compare us to other companies, so that we would say what we have is unique from them. What I would like to better emphasize is what are our strengths. What are those things that we do well? Because anybody who's out there teaching good continuing education and helping their students become better so that they can go out and serve the general public is somebody that I don't necessarily want to overcome. It would be a way of saying them and us. And I can't see us as professionals always talking them and us. We have to really talk about what is our goal as a profession and as individuals. But I do think that the things that you've already mentioned, that we've mentioned, are some of the strengths that we have within our organization. I also say that it's another strength that I would say we do is we emphasize the journey of the individual and the recognition of their journey. We often say in classes, who you are in the treatment room is sometimes more important than what you do. I think that each individual, and it's one of the weaknesses of the medical profession as a whole, is we train them in diagnostician and treatment, but we never train them in passion, in compassion, in who they are in that treatment room and how important that is. And the more we look at this, more we realize that we are the greatest placebo on the planet when we're in that room with that patient. And so we emphasize that component with everyone that we're training, is to have them go on the journey of exploring who they are and what they can offer within that treatment. And so I'd say that's one of our strengths, is the individual's journey, not just their education.
I get asked this question a lot when I'm at conferences talking. So what makes IPA different? Why should I take an IPA course versus another course? And my answer is pretty much oriented around what it is we teach. We don't teach techniques.
Yeah.
The Institute of Physical Art was developed to teach a system of clinical reasoning for both evaluation and treatment. And that system creates structure which allows a therapist to develop their pattern recognition more efficiently. And we know from all the research that's out there that pattern recognition is what really separates young professionals from master clinicians. They've shown that now multiple ways. And pattern recognition, the development of pattern recognition is a very specific process. They've analyzed it ad nauseum, mostly the philosophers. And to accomplish that, therapists need structure, but the structure has to allow for variables. And I think a lot of our students are coming out of school today feeling like they have structure, but it's a very limiting structure. It's like an enclosure that they have to function within, rather than a platform that allows them to see everything around them. And we want our structure to be a platform that's a springboard, a platform that other things can come to, not a box that keeps everything out and just lets you function within. And so from the very beginning, even though we didn't officially define our system until the early 90s, that's when we actually named it functional manual therapy, our system has always been to look at the system with three pillars, not interrelated, but interdependent.
Yeah.
The mechanical system, the neuromuscular function system, and the motor control system. And so our institute teaches you in every single class to look at each one of those systems from an interdependency to the other system. So you can't just be someone who knows how to mobilize a joint. You have to be someone who knows how to mobilize that joint and understand not only its mechanical capacity, but how the surrounding neuromuscular function is either affected by or has an effect on the mechanical capacity, and how those two working together can alter and change our motor control, and how our motor control can alter and change the mechanics and neuromuscular function. So every class that we're teaching it's so funny, we have several faculty that work in PT programs around the country, and they tell their students, functional manual therapy just makes sense because it's very simplistic in its structure, but it's very open and inclusive within its structure. And I think that I love the quote from Louis Pasteur. He said that chance follows the prepared mind. And so for us, you see, and there are two things in that quote that I think are very important to what sets us apart. The first one is chance. Chance means that I might happen upon a truth. I might just happen upon a truth if I have the state of mind to be looking and being alert to that truth. And I think you need a structure to create your mind being open to input that can allow you to recognize a truth. And so often our students are being taught to shut down their mind rather than have your mind open. And Greg and I used to talk about intuition. I just have an intuition that this is right. I've just seen it. I feel it's the right thing. And people are, you can't teach that. And we're like, well, you can't teach intuition, but there's no such thing as intuition. This is what was said in the 70s and 80s. There's no such thing as intuition. And now what do we have? We have all the science of intuition. We know that it is in fact a scientific process, that pattern recognition, intuition go hand in hand. We were willing to step out as educators and stand on something that we saw working rather than hide behind, if I can't explain it, I'm not going to share it. And I think that too often we limit the potential of physical therapists practicing in the clinic. We limit their potential to discover who they are because we tell them not to think. We tell them not to be creative. We tell them to be robots and technicians. And that is never what the IPA is taught. And so because we had a system that helped to give you the opportunity by preparing your mind to think outside the box and be ready to recognize when there's something there, I think that our institute does something very powerful that, again, has now been shown through science to be very important. We give hope. We give hope to therapists, hope that they can make changes they didn't think they can make, hope to patients. I'll never forget a patient that had been treated for years that came into a seminar that Greg and I were doing. We had about 100 people there just watching us for the day treat patients. And we didn't know any of the patients. They were brought in by members of the audience. And this one woman came in, and after 45 minutes, she just started crying. And we really hadn't even been doing that much with her yet, but she said something that impacted my life. She said, for the first time, I have hope that maybe something can be different. And for some reason, our profession has shifted to this paradigm that we shouldn't be giving hope to patients. We should just be doing what the research says we can do. Research comes about because there are people in the trenches saying things work. And we need to get back we need to be fostering the creativeness of our profession to keep taking us forward rather than holding us back.
I think that is a fantastic take because, I think there's been a lot of people that have kind of mentioned the definite pendulum swing more towards the evidence avenue of evidence-based practice, and rather than neglecting or putting less emphasis on the other two avenues. So I think, like you kind of had mentioned, that integration and interconnection between them all, and recognizing that they kind of build and kind of contribute to the other, and they all have a very important place and time in our development of our profession, but also in our treatment of patients. So I think that's a fantastic point. And I want to kind of go a little bit more broad now in terms of continuing education, because seeing as how things are now, I know there are some things going on in continuing education. There are some distinct challenges that can exist. So from your guys' perspective, what do you guys see are the biggest challenges that exist when it comes to physical therapy continuing education across the U.S.? And I know we both kind of hinted at some of these a little bit earlier throughout the discussion, but let's kind of formally dive into maybe some others that you guys are noticing that perhaps maybe we haven't touched on already.
So I think that there are two areas that we experience challenges. I think the first area is in the business aspect of running a continuing education company. The first challenge is because there are so many companies, how do we get the word out and differentiate? What is the proper medium for communicating with the current people that want to eventually take our classes and would be a potential participant in our classes? But I think beyond that, it's the overarching attitude about the importance of continuing education, and that's top down. There's just this year alone, every year we do our schedule in early summer to midsummer for the following year. And so our company will do anywhere from 130 to 150 seminars just in the US. So we're dealing with a lot of different facilities and setting up those courses around the country. And just this year alone, there have been multiple sites that have over the years hosted us that have now been bought out by corporations or merged with corporations who do not recognize the value of live on-site continuing education. They just see that for their employees to retain their license, they need to satisfy their CEU requirements, of which can be done mostly online. So there's this shift in trying to appreciate why it's important to study in person with someone versus just taking an online course. You know, Albert Einstein, obviously recognized as one of the most brilliant minds in human history. He said it was very, very important to understand that information is not knowledge. Information is not knowledge. I can go online and I can gather a lot of information. Knowledge is the application of that information. Knowledge is the interpretation and application. That takes exposure to one, clinicians who've been in the trenches doing it, clinicians who have the expertise to take your hand and guide it how it should touch a patient, to give you feedback when a participant touches you. No, you're just not quite holding me quite right. To be able to have that exchange that cannot be done online. And unfortunately, because a lot of the young professionals today were raised in the era of technology and that I can get anything and everything I need by opening up my computer or my cell phone and accessing that information, they've lost the understanding of the transition between information and knowledge. So our biggest challenge as a continuing education company in this day, 2019, 2020, is imparting the message that there is value, not just, and it's got to come from the therapist first, because when enough therapists believe passionately, they will argue with their corporation and they will say, no, we can't do this. Either you let us come in and do this and gather together and learn together, or we're not going to be able to provide you the care that you want. So I think it's also very important. The other challenge is having a continuing education company, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, that allows the vehicle for the evidence to be integrated and to be shown to be important within what you teach. Mm-hmm. You know, in the early years, we didn't do empirical research as a profession. We just didn't do it. And it wasn't until the 90s where we started really having a lot of really good RCTs and things. And of course, now we're shifting away from that because, as Gregg said earlier, we're realizing just as walking into the room, we're a placebo and you can't take that away. But Gregg and I recognized very early on, if we're going to be an impactful continuing education company, we also have to be impactful in the area of research. So in 2012, we set up the Functional Manual Therapy Foundation. And this foundation is a nonprofit organization that is geared toward fostering research, that the research that looks at things from that. I love how now we have functional medicine. It basically, let's go back to the original term we used in the 70s. It looks at it from the holistic perspective of how to treat the human body in those three pillars, the integration, the mechanical, neuromuscular, and motor control. We have a foundation that's from that has come the only postural classification that has been shown to be valid and reliable. It's the Saliba Postural Classification System that was published, because throughout the medical profession and physical therapy, we were told, you've got to teach posture, you got to treat posture, but no one had tried to validate it. And so it's like we're trying to participate in that and find the balance between how do we create research that empowers us, not limits us, and how do we incorporate that research into our education?
I'm learning how I have to be flexible to really continue to adapt myself to the present environment of the physical therapy profession. We recognize now that 3.5-day courses are no longer the vehicle that the average ones of the this present generation wants to take. They desire shorter interventions. And how can we continue to adapt what our offerings are to meet the needs of individuals? So we've had to shift to 2-day courses. We've had to shift to providing more online information. And sometimes we feel like that the product itself is more difficult now to be able to present and to do the transformational components that I believe that is our goal for physical therapists. But being able to adapt to the present environment is right now one of our greatest challenges, and it's one of our greatest goals as we move forward, to still be able to have the product be available to those who desire to learn.
And I would ask you, I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, but I would ask you a personal question. And you stated earlier that you had taken continuing education in multiple different organizations, and one of them was through the Maitland approach. And I would ask you, how long was your Maitland course? How many days was your Maitland course?
From what I remember, it was 2.
So my Maitland course in 1978 was 10 days, 2 full weeks that I had to take off work to go and learn and study under 2 expert clinicians. I remember going and taking a course with Ola Grimsby in Park City, and Gregg and I were so excited. It was a cervical class, and the class started at 8 in the morning, and at 6 at night, when the class would typically end, Ola would say, okay, I'm going to go grab dinner. I'll be back in about an hour for anyone that wants to come back, and we'll just keep going. And we would go to 11 o'clock, and that was 5 days in a row. And now we have students that put on their evaluation, I feel like we need a break every 5 minutes. Literally. And it's like, or a 2.5 day course is too much information. I can't process that. I need you to break this up into smaller courses. And so the challenge for continuing education today is trying to actually challenge the participant to go beyond what they think is their limitation and realize the human brain does not have that kind of restriction inherently within it. We create those restrictions of our learning potential. And so Gregg and I, we feel like today we're not just teaching how to be a physical therapist, we're teaching people kind of principles of learning. You need to break out of this. You need to realize you got to push sometimes. You've got to let yourself feel stressed if you're really going to grow and learn.
And I think that this just really emphasizes a point of observation that we've had over the years. Our early students had a passion for learning, and they viewed themselves as professionals as being the part of the goal of their life. And so they didn't work just to provide an income for their family or for their private fun. But the modern group seems to have a much more focus that the reason I work is for the things that I want for me. For my entertainment, for my other components. So to take a weekend away from me to take a continuing education course in this environment seems to be a sacrifice. Where in our days, it was one of those things that was a great excitement because we were going to go learn something to become more excellent at what we're doing so that we become better, because part of our self-image was in the quality of physical therapists that we became.
No, I mean, I think you bring up some really, really solid points throughout that. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And I think a lot of that certainly seems to make sense. And, we usually like to kind of finish every single episode with this big finale is, if you could change one aspect of healthcare education, whether that be physical therapy or otherwise, which aspect would you change and how would you change it?
Had I not already brought it up, I would really choose the development of each individual within healthcare education, being able to become truly healthcare practitioners. I would really want to deal more with our individual journey and our individual views and the way that we deal with our patients. So that being aside, I would really say I would like to see, when we start talking about the evidence, about the scientific process, about how we apply that to our practice, is I would rather see us present the evidence from a point of view of recognizing that it is an ever-growing, ever-discovery of the truth, that where we're at right now is not at truth. And therefore, you cannot necessarily do an evidence-based practice and only use the evidence for the treatment of each one of your patients. Possibly in pharmacology, we have some very great strengths of being able to use evidence and apply that evidence to our treatment. But when it comes to the human musculoskeletal motor system, we don't have the evidence yet to be able to say that that's the exclusive mechanism. So I'd say it's our responsibility to understand the evidence, to be able to apply the evidence, but to step outside of the evidence, that it is not a holy grail, that it is not something that we can base everything that we do upon. And I'd really like to see, can we shift that component in our profession right now? That is training a lot of our youth, and Vicky mentioned this earlier, to be technicians. These are the symptoms, and these are the evidence behind how you treat those symptoms. And you go down this checklist instead of being an observer of function, being able to see what the greatest need of that patient is. And what we try to teach our students is, what is their greatest need right now, and how do we address that? And I'd say you have to do it on the physical. You have to do it on the mental. You have to do it on the emotional, and you have to do it on the spiritual levels. We have to be able to impact that individual and recognize what their greatest needs are. And if you're going to do an evidence-based approach, you don't have those options of being able to observe. You're not trained to observe. You're not trained to be a problem solver. And I think the most powerful thing we have as individuals to offer other individuals is our skill of being able to solve their problems and to go into it with clinical reasoning based upon what evidence we have.
All right. So I entered physical therapy school in 1975, and little did I know that I was actually walking in as a lab rat, because the director of our program was the late Dr. Bella May. And she was very well known within the education section because in the 1970s, she put forth a curriculum known as a problem-solving curriculum for physical therapists. And we were one of only 5 programs in the United States at that time that was learning to become and training to become a physical therapy within this problem-solving curriculum. And her whole focus was that we need to learn, that we need to teach our PT students how to think. They would actually tell us, you're barely going to pass your boards because your boards are just a regurgitation of data, but you're going to be phenomenal in the clinic. And they would tell us that. And I remember things like sitting in a classroom and all of a sudden, because there'd be a door on either side, a faculty would walk through, and the faculty up front would just keep talking. And then after the one walking through left, the faculty up front would say, okay, everyone put your pencils down. What did you notice about that person that just walked through? Training us to continuously be paying attention to our environment and gathering information that could influence what we were doing. So if I could change one thing in today's education, I would say, let's turn back the clock. Let's go retro. Let's go back to the time when we taught our students to think, when we taught our students to problem solve. But the reality is you cannot teach problem solving without experience. You need to get students early on into situations where they don't walk into a clinical rotation and be expected to treat 40 patients their first week. Because how are they going to learn? They're not observing. They're not listening. They're not getting to be mentored. Too many of our students, when they go into their clinicals today, are basically just cheap labor. And like in our clinics, when we bring in students, they're not even really allowed to touch a patient for the first couple of weeks. They're told to just follow us, listen to us, watch what we do, hear how we think. And now when you go and you begin to touch a patient, you have something that you can correlate what you're seeing and feeling to what you've seen. So these are our goals, is that we want to see that we are promoting pattern recognition through problem-solving curriculum that's working more closely with clinicians as the CIs whose intent and goal as a CI is truly to transform the student through the educational process rather than satisfy their needs and goals.
I think that's fantastic because, Vicky, we've heard a variation of that answer quite a few times and really trying to get away from more just having to pass requirements to make that checklist, but really teaching students how to ultimately be successful learners and independent clinicians. capable of critical thinking and, pattern recognition, and ultimately, learning to kind of progress towards their own level of expertise. So I think that's a great answer. And that's something I've definitely heard quite a bit. And guys, I really appreciate the insight, because I've certainly learned a lot. I've definitely had some internal thinking moments in my head hearing both of you guys speak. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate all that you guys have done throughout the profession and what you guys are continuing to do. But I recognize, of course, people might want to, of course, look online or maybe learn a little bit more, or even touch base on kind of what we had talked about. Where can people reach out or follow you guys online? Should they either have a question or just want to kind of see what you're up to?
Well, if they go basically to our website, which you can go to either the long URL is instituteofphysicalart.com, or you can just type in the IPA, like the beer, but we're not the beer. We were around before, I think, the IPA beer. But anyway, just type in the IPA, or you can type in functional manual therapy. All of those will take you to our website, and from there it'll link you to Facebook, Instagram, whatever else you want to follow us. The other thing is, I would say just connect with someone in your community that has had exposure to what we do and what we teach. Ask them. As I said in the very beginning, our strength of who we are and what we are was built on word of mouth, because I don't ever want anyone taking our class just because they think they have to. I want them to take it because they want to, because someone has inspired them, someone has stimulated them to want to be better at who they are, and go back to the very philosophy of our organization. Our slogan is discover your potential. We want people to take our class because they want to discover more of their potential. So talk to people who've taken our classes and let them guide you.
Well, I love it. And thank you both again so much for your time and for coming on today. It's been truly a pleasure having you both on.
Thank you, Brandon.
Access to healthcare is one of the largest issues facing both providers and patients, as millions of people worldwide lack timely and affordable access to healthcare. Anywhere Healthcare, a telehealth platform, is a simple, low-cost option for providers and patients that eliminates the barriers to access to all kinds of healthcare. To find out more, check out anywhere.healthcare, which is available in our show notes. And if you use the code HET in all caps when you email to sign up, you'll save 25% off the total cost. Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter at HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.